Okay, so, and when everyone is coming, the recording started, okay? Good.
Hola.
Okay, hello, how are you? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, so depends. Here in Providence, Rhode Island is like, we can say good afternoon, buenas tardes, perfectly well. So thank you so much to being today in our book presentation, sorry. Well, it's not book presentation, it's an special issue a presentation that even is better, and it's the first time that in Feministas Unidas we are going to present like a special issue. So thank you so much. I am Ana Isabel Simón-Alegre. I am from Adelphi University, and also I am the president of Feministas Unidas, at least until December. So yeah, it's a pleasure to welcome today to Rebecca Haidt and Angela Acosta. And also thank you everyone to be part of today's presentation. I can see some of the collaborators in the special issue. Thank you so much, because thanks to this wonderful collaboration, we can make possible to do like an issue like Professor Haidt and Professor Acosta put it together. So I am going to do like a very short introduction, of the special issue. And after this, Rebecca and Angela, they are going to control between code the event. So, and we'll see if we can have like 10 minutes, 15 minutes for open questions. Please use the chat for questions, and, when we're finished with the special issue presentation, everyone can unmute and to ask the question perfectly well. Okay, so do you have any questions? Something we have to talk about it? No? Okay, so the first thing that I want to say is like Feministas Unidas, we have a couple of awards. Then also Angela won a couple of these ones, the Graduate Student Award Emilia Pardo Bazán and the Creative Writing. Also, please, submit your work, because always we are looking forward to have like a lot of submissions. So, and what else I want to mention? So about Feministas Unidas. So please be part of the community, because thanks to the memberships, we can make possible this kind of events. We are going to every year to MLA conference, LASA conference, and always we like to support everyone in the academic community. Please share with us your new books, publications, etc. and etc. So, and after this, so the first thing is to say thank you to Professor Haidt and Acosta for the wonderful special issue, Spanish Sapphic Modernity, Building Bridge of Solidarity. I think that one is the title of the introduction. And but also is the title of the special issues. Then the journal Feminist Modernist Studies put it together last year. So, and it's an special issue very important for me, because like 2 years ago, Professor Luciano Deutsch and I, we put it together like a book about, something similar, queer studies in the Hispanic literature. And, because Professor Charnon and I, we are like, our expertise is 19th century. We were very focusing in the last period of 19th century and the beginning of 20th centuries, because usually, queer studies, lesbian studies, they are thinking more in the, in the 20th centuries. Well, Professor Charnon, Deutsch, and Professor Haidt is here. That, you know, is part about this kind of conversation. 19th century is more, and the women's and men in 19th century, we can explore using a different kind of perspectives, like queer studies, for example. And I think it's a wonderful continuation, this special issue of our work, and I feel very proud to see something like this, because sometimes, and that one is my personal opinion, I miss in academic this kind of dialogues. You know, we are not one against another one. We don't want like to be, oh, the first scholar who put it together, something like this. No, I think it's important to get that kind of continuation, you know, than if we put it something that a different academic can feel great, and to continue that dialogue, I think is the most important thing that we can do. And I feel like this, you know, it's a continuation and it's a working in progress. And also Professor Jeff Zamostny is here. Sorry, maybe I pronounced very terrible your last name, but I want to also to highlight the MLA proposal that Professor Zamostny and Acosta, they put it together for the next MLA conference, and also for the San Francisco conference and PMMLA, right? So, and I can see that it's a dialogue and it's a continued conversation and research. So, and it's in these times that we are living right now, I think it's very important to be like this, continuing our dialogues, and especially about queer studies and about women and men. They have a different way to approach their everyday life and also to speak about it. So, and with this kind of like very like simple remarks, I want to open the microphone for both, for Professor Acosta and Professor Haidt, and say thank you so much for everything. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm really appreciative of the support of Feministas Unidas for this issue, and also the way that we're in dialogue with your work is really lovely to continue that conversation. So the way this event will work is I'll briefly introduce our special issue, and then I'll hand it off to each of our collaborators who are here today, starting with Jeffrey Samotny, then Christina Karageorgou-Bastea, and Elena Bonmatí Gonzálvez. We did have a few folks who weren't able to join us, and we're grateful to have this recorded for later. Yeah, so this special issue really started with wanting to extend a dialogue about Sapphic modernity beyond the Spanish-speaking world. A couple of years ago, I had just joined the Intersectional Feminist and Queer Praxis Special Interest Group of MSA, the Modernist Studies Association, and was having really great conversations with folks about Anglophone modernist studies and questions of gender and sexuality, and all of those canonical works like The Well of Loneliness, Virginia Woolf's work, all of those sorts of touchstone texts within Anglophone modernist studies, and thinking about how I then could bring some of my own work and that of my colleagues in Spanish modernism to really show the dialogues therein, right? Because a lot of these writers knew each other, were reading each other's works, were really fueled by those kind of similarities and themes and challenges that they were facing in their lives. So through that, Rebecca and I were able to pitch this issue to Feminist Modernist Studies through the Feminist Intersectional Modernist Praxis Special Interest Group. And we were really excited to then have folks working specifically on Spain, but thinking transatlantically, thinking nationally, thinking about these texts in relation to Spain and the Anglophone and global modernist worlds and scholarly conversations. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about what folks have to say about their work. And we also, because we have some people here from the Ohio State colloquium, I really would love to have kind of that conversation about how these projects arose for the graduate students here in the audience, as well as, of course, hearing about what future work you have to share. So we'll start with Jeffrey Samotny to give a little summary of his article. And as he's doing that, I'm going to put a slideshow in the background with some of the great images related to his project.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Angela. So while the slideshow is coming up, I just want to thank Feministas Unidas for hosting this event and Ana Simón-Alegre, to everyone for attending, and very especially to Angela and Rebecca for editing this volume. Really, from start to finish, it was a pleasure to work with you, and just it was done with such care and such professionalism. So it was really a pleasure to participate. So my contribution to the volume is titled Tortola Valencia, Jose Zamora, and the Art of Queer Collaboration. And in it, I examine the relationship between modern dancer Carmen Tortola Valencia and illustrator Jose Pepito Zamora, two figures from early 20th century Spain's burgeoning yet long overlooked queer culture. I argue that their interactions between 1914 and 17 comprise an art of queer collaboration that nurtured them personally and professionally, launched and sustained their celebrity, and left behind an archive of texts and artworks that are best considered a product of their joint authorship, many of which we're going to see throughout this slideshow. My interest in this collaboration belongs to a larger project on forms of queer sociability and popular culture in Spain over the 3 decades prior to the Spanish Civil War. One of my central arguments is that creative partnerships between people across gender and sexual categories were more prevalent and important in this context than has been recognized to this point. In a chapter on Anglophone queer literature of the early 1900s, Jane Garrity and Tirza True Latimer reflect on queer cross-gender collaboration, which they call, quote, a central component of lesbian and gay culture formation, and indeed culture formation tout court, throughout the 20th century. It has marked the histories of literature, art, music, dance, fashion, and architecture in ways that remain virtually unexplored, end quote. Today, this holds true in studies of early 20th century Spain, which tend to segregate discussions of male homosexuality from those of lesbianism or sapphism and those of non-normative sex and gender. This is a missed opportunity to explore how modern queer culture regularly defied compartmentalization along these lines. In my article, Tortola and Zamora's case exemplifies the creative potential of queer cross-gender collaboration in the Spanish context. By way of introduction, Carmen Tortola Valencia was the first Spanish dancer to break with balletic tradition and pursue a solo career around a repertoire of classical, Orientalist, and Spanish dances, much in the line of Isadora Duncan, Ruth St. Denis, or Maud Allen. Tortola debuted in London in 1908, danced in Madrid's Romea Theatre and Ateneo in 1911 and 13, toured Spain and Latin America through 1930, and retired until her death in 1955 to a Barcelona apartment with her adopted daughter, secretary, and life partner, Ángeles Magret Vilá. Several aspects of Tortola's career have garnered attention in a growing body of recuperative scholarship over the past 2 decades. Her intense dance aesthetic, by turns sensual and aggressive, her incarnation of the femme fatale on and off stage, her savvy self-promotion in photographs and interviews, and her entourage of admirers numbering such creators as Valle-Inclán, Gómez de la Serna, and Ignacio Zuloaga. In contrast, Jose Zamora remains largely absent from recent scholarship, except as a secondary figure in studies of Tortola or the better-known queer writers Álvaro Retana and Antonio de Hoyos y Vinent. Zamora studied fashion and costume design at Paul Poiret's Paris studio in 1913 and 14, illustrated and designed magazines for, illustrated and designed for magazines, short novel collections, variety shows, and ballets in Spain from 1914 to 18, ran fashion studios in Madrid, Paris, and Athens at various times between 1916 and 1941, and eventually took refuge from the Second World War in Sitges, where he lived quite openly with his long-term partner Jose Constantinides until their deaths in 1971. My article shows that more than a minor figure, Zamora should be regarded as a crucial collaborator within the queer culture of the 1910s and 20s, one who worked with Hoyos, Retana, and Tortola to thoroughly intertwine life and art in a public performance of celebrity and friendship. The years 1914 through 17 comprised the most intense period of interaction between Tortola and Zamora, when they regularly coincided in Madrid. This is the time when Zamora, Tortola, and Hoyos paraded around the city in extravagant garb, when Zamora created images of Tortola for articles and novels, when Zamora and other authors featured him and Tortola as characters in their works, when Tortola danced in costumes designed by Zamora, and when Zamora performed dances inspired by Tortola. This was also the time when Zamora and Tortola's professional activities were tightly intertwined with gossip and scandal that made scrutiny of their gender and sexuality a key element of their celebrity and public personas. In what sense did Tortola and Zamora's interactions before and during World War I take shape as a queer collaboration? What forms of art and sociability emerged out of their connection? And how was their partnership beneficial to both parties? My article seeks to answer these questions by analyzing three clusters of archival sources that I assembled, respectively, around Tortola and Zamora's co-appearances in public space, Zamora's dance performances, and Zamora's visual art and literature concerning Tortola, especially his short novel, Princesas de Aquelarre. In the final analysis, I argue that examining Tortola and Zamora together animates new approaches to the study of queer culture in early 20th century Spain. Their queer art of collaboration defies easy classification under the commonly used labels of male or female homosexuality, lesbianism, or even in the context of this event, Sapphic Modernity, depending on how we define that exactly. It also fits uncomfortably in studies that focus solely on literature, dance, or visual art. It is by assembling a multidisciplinary archive of public performances, dances, costume designs, illustrations, novels, newspaper reports, memoirs, and gossip, and by examining that archive through the malleable framework of queer collaboration, that Tortola and Zamora's relationship comes into sharper focus and reveals the richness of a queer past that has been out of sight for too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be able to feature your work and really show those overlaps and collaborations, and, beyond just questions of gender. Next, we'll have Elena, and if we could just stop the recording here. Anna.
Thank you very much for organizing this forum. After Elena's exploration a little bit of the turbulences of the life of Ángeles Vicente, I would like to create a connection between the east and the west of Europe, the two edges of Southern Europe, between a book that Ángeles Vicente publishes in 1909 and a book that appears in Greece a year after The Well of Loneliness, so into 1929. So, but my comparison of these two books has to do with the way Spain and Greece enter modernity. So I'll talk a little bit about the stage of these two novels, this historical stage, and then I will tell you what I analyze. So we all know about the war with the United States, Spain's war in 1898. As a reaction to this penultimate imperial debacle, national intelligentsia voiced urgent claims for change in institutions such as education, religion, resources management, industrial development. This attitude channeled calms about national identity and the demands for regeneration. Regeneration is very important, and I hope to show you why. While it also left its mark on the literary production of the Generación del 98. Between 1919 and 1922, territorial aspirations loomed since the War of Independence, and the establishment of the modern Greek nation in 1830 led the Balkan country to yet another war against the dying Ottoman Empire and the vigorous newly founded nation state in which Turkey was converted under Kemal Atatürk. The conclusion of the conflict in defeat for the Greeks was followed by the tragic displacement of 2 million refugees exchanged between the two countries after the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, 500,000 Muslim and 1.5 million Greek Orthodox. On the level of the nation building, this defeat eliminated from the political sphere the ideology of irredentism, namely the claims of territories where Greek Orthodox population had lived for millennia before and throughout the era of Ottoman rule. An account of such social and ideological context of nationalist impetus and disaster was given by the most acclaimed group of Greek writers in the literary history of modern Greece, known as generation of 1930. The two historical conflicts are a quarter of century apart. Nevertheless, because of the peripheral positions of Greek and Spain in European modernity and modernism, they created comparable ideological frameworks. Namely, 1898 Spain and 1922 Greece questioned national identity and alterity in the wounded national body. The topic of my analysis is middle-class Saphists and lesbians in Spain and Greece in the 31st years of the 20th century. I propose to examine the social repercussions and political resonances of practicing and narrating desire between women as opposite to both the model of a woman mother, typical of conservative nationalism, and that of the new woman championed by proto-feminists in Greece and Spain. I maintain that in addition to carrying out the uttermost potential of the claim for women's emancipation, namely the rebellion against the role of women in reproduction as part of regenerating the suffering body of the nation, the Sapphic lover and narrator presents herself as a model of alternative citizenship. The ideological territory I explore responds to the unmapped spaces that are lost when we look at peripheral European modernity in terms of the clash between traditions and avant-gardisms, working class and bourgeois morals, innovation and conservatism. I focus on two narratives, Zese, Spain, 1909, by Ángeles Vicente, and the Two Lovers. The book was translated into English as The Two Lovers by Dora Rossetti. The two books circulated little at the time of their original edition, disappeared for several decades, along with information about their authors. Now, after the work of Elena, we know a lot about Ángeles Vicente. Muchas gracias, Elena. And they reappeared at the beginning of the 21st century, coincidentally both in 2005. We have news about Ángeles Vicente, and we have also some news behind the pseudonym of Dora Rossetti. Framed within these similarities, my reading argues in favor of more substantial convergences. I maintain that the social, political, and sexual dimensions of the Sapphist protagonists constitute a multifaceted critique to the society that came out of the Spanish and Greek historical debacles. They defy the ideology of national regeneration by negating motherhood. They claim parity by taking the stance for social mobility. Their gender clashes with dominant androcentric ideology because they place women at the center of a citizen's agency. And finally, they put under scrutiny the main idea of nation itself. For all three protagonists pose problems regarding their inclusion within the national body. So Zeze is a Spanish coupletist that is traveling between Buenos Aires and Montevideo. And at the end of the Greek novel, the two women lovers leave Greece to go to Italy. So they are apart. They separate their bodies from the nation's body. Zeze and the two lovers achieved the creation of fora for the staging of women's rights claims by using homosexual desire as an instrumental element that biologically and symbolically differentiates women from regeneration. I propose to read Zese and the Eumenides, the two lovers, as two radical attempts to walk the path of emancipation using the construction of political, cultural, and gender identities based on negative critique against both androcracy and proto-feminist androcentrism. So I will tell you very, if my dog lets me. So I will tell you a little bit about what happens in the two lovers. Dora, the author protagonist, insists in the queerness of most everything that characterizes the atmosphere of her affair with Lisa. Lisa is her lover. The passion, the influence of the two women have on one another, the feelings, the eroticisms, all thoughts that originated in this desire by using a very particular adjective in Greek, which is allokotos. Allos means different, but allokotos means exactly queer, very strange. No, Simon, don't talk. She has a clear consciousness of being a lesbian, and her desire for Lisa is unabashed. Lisa, on the other hand, is ambivalent. At night, she loves with passion. During the day, she mistreats her lover. Lisa is actively bisexual. The love affair starts a night of carnival, where identities celebrate temporarily fluctuation behind masks, and gender lines can be crossed playfully. Dora announces plenty of times that she is and feels ugly. On the contrary, Lisa has an exotic beauty that Dora constantly parallels with Spanish women, with the goddess Astarte of Semitic and Mesopotamian origin, investing her lover with stereotypical and Orientalist assumptions that also align with her exuberant sexuality. In the two novels, the paradigm of the Sapphic lover manifests itself in the critical dichotomy between feminism as a political attitude in the national panorama of European periphery and identity politics as activism that confronts social problems. Zese and Hieromenides, two lovers, emerge as answers to questions of inclusion that the national projects of Spain and Greece at the beginning of the 20th century were not even able to ask themselves. The two novels highlight women who inhabit the outskirts of the social and political unconscious. Intertwined in these questions that society cannot ask and answers that cannot be heard are the rhetoric of nationalism, the tradition of the feminine question, participatory democracy, controversies about education, synergies between social classes. Vicente and Rossetti offer a separatist activism that continually intersects with the acutest problem of their time and place. The sexual dissident embodied in their protagonist fuels the desire for justice that links two quite different aesthetic projects. So that is what I'm trying to tell in my paper, and we can talk more about this as the conversation unfolds.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's really fascinating that Zese, which is the name of the titular character of the novel, this novel comes around about, 20 years prior to A Well of Loneliness, which is always kind of situated as the cornerstone of Anglophone Sapphic modernity. So next, what we'd like to do, since we don't have all of our contributors here right now, is to talk a little bit about those essays whose authors aren't here in person, and also talk a little bit about our introductory essay. So Rebecca, if you could start by talking about Margarita's essay, and I can share those wonderful images from the Residencias de Señoritas archive on screen.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you so much to all the contributors who could appear and for all of your work. To Ana and to Feministas Unidas for hosting a focus on this special issue. And I want to thank Angela in particular for bringing me into this project, for her vision for this project, and all of the work that she did to bring it together. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you everybody for your interest in the project. I just will say a few words that are taken from our introduction, but that might help orient my contribution to the project. So I had the great honor and pleasure of working with Angela when she was doing her dissertation at Ohio State. My areas are 18th century Spanish writing, early 19th century costumbrismo. I'm not somebody who has built up a body of scholarship on modernism at all, or feminism, but Angela's discussions with me really helped me a lot, right? Turn back toward my work with a mind toward what might have grown out of the periods in which I specialize. And in particular, a project that I was working on while Angela was doing her dissertation, which is a volume of translations of poems by Carolina Coronado, who was a kind of a pre-modernist forerunner and inspiration for many of the figures who are analyzed. There she is. So thank you so much, Angela. Yeah. There's Coronado. She lived 1820 to 1911. She's really fortunate because there have been multiple excellent biographies on Carolina Coronado's work. If you have access to Spanish, it's there, but you might not know her work, even if you are a Spanish speaker, partly because so much romantic work that was done by women didn't make it into a lot of anthologies, right? Or collections of romanticism or critical kind of overviews of romanticism until the 1980s or 90s, when scholars really began trying to recuperate women writers and the contributions of writers who were thinking about women and their creativity and their ideas. It was a great time in the mid-19th century to be thinking about modern ideas. And that is the point at which I enter with Carolina Coronado, to take seriously. It was a great gift, the work that Angela did with me and the conversations we had. It was a great gift to me to take seriously the work of Carolina Coronado as something that was feminist and modernist avant la lettre, right? Like that later writers who were modernists and who were feminists really looked to her for inspiration. And so I've grown a lot thinking about the connections. I'll just say a few words about that's drawn from our introduction. But I'm just going to say a few words from the introduction about Carolina Coronado. Angela, please help keep me on time. You know, I could go on forever.
Did you want me to
okay.
put the introduction on screen while you do that?
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so Anna's introduction today reminded us of the volume that she recently edited with Luchern and Deutsch that was focusing on queer women and queer writings, right? End of the 19th century and then during the early years of the 20th century. The thing that was a challenge for me at first was to think, well, how does Carolina Coronado fit in with this? Because she wasn't queer as we might understand it, you know, by any metric. But it's not hard to, if one looks back at history, right, and at the culture of the period, and recognizes that what we now call queer is something, you know, battles around queerness or queering is something that analogously, let's put it, was happening, right, at the mid-19th century, coming out of Romanticism. There were many literary battles about poetic voicings that might serve purposes of exalting the nation or promoting new goals for civic society. But women were not supposed to have much of a role in those literary voicings. Nonetheless, they wrote. And Carolina Coronado was an early defender of women's use of their voices, right? And in that, she's somebody who challenged heteronormative expectations, as did many other women during the time. But Coronado had a very special kind of contribution in this. She was somebody who was a master of classical and classical forms. She was also somebody who was a master of history. She knew a lot about history. And what Coronado in particular, I think, brought to this modernist feminist forerunner work was making one of the aims of her body of work, at least during the 1840s, when poems such like El Tiempo, or Time, which is something that Angela and I cite from in our introduction. It's kind of a Byronian poem that looks over history, right, and considers, yes, thank you. By the way, this is a typo here in this particular website. It should be a la luz de nuestro cielo, not ciclo, right? So they got that wrong. But this is a kind of overview of time, centuries of Spanish time, in which the speaker situates herself in a modernity that seems completely impossible, right, for her to comprehend. But if she knows one thing, it's that the very modernity of which she is part has also given birth to her voice. And because her voice is inseparable from the time into which she was born, she sees herself as just like men, faced with a challenge, right? A challenge of how to do your best, a challenge of how to contribute, how to find others with whom to work and meet the challenges of your time. It's a lovely poem. So one of the things that we quote from this poem, which was written in 1847, are these three lines where Coronado, and this is a translation from the translation that I did, so it's in English, but she says, society is born, thinks, and wanes, right? The idea that societies go through ages is a very old one, right? Ours is in the age of thought, nor are women as beings exempt. So women and their minds, everything about them, right? Manos a la obra and mentes a la obra, right? They are faced with challenges, and it's up to women too, to heal and to lead. That's how Angela and I connected in this project. And I've learned so much through doing this project. One of the things that was really wonderful was the opportunity to work more with Margarita Marquez Padorno, who's one of our contributors and who unfortunately couldn't be here to join us. And yeah, this is her essay on the screen. And Margarita's work is really wonderful. She comes to this project as somebody who has spent years working on the history of journalism and communications, education and culture in Spain, in 19th and in early 20th century Spain. And one of her special areas of study is the Residencia de Señoritas. So it was really a treat for us to have Marga's work as part of this project, especially because Marga's essay so nicely connects to the next essay, right, in the volume. Really helps us see how these transatlantic connections of intellectual women who were growing out of 19th century intellectual movements, how they really helped create a kind of Sapphic Modernist ethos through this institution, the Residencia de Señoritas.
I'm going to put the PowerPoint with those pictures up now.
Okay. But Angela, would you like to say a few words also about the connection that the Residencia de Señoritas makes for us between, let's say, Sapphic queer lesbian circles, but then also intellectual feminist, let's say cultural agent circles more broadly in terms of institutions?
Yeah, it's the Residencia de Señoritas, or unmarried women's residence, is located in Madrid, and it's pretty much within walking distance of the Residencia de Estudiantes, where men would study and come from elsewhere in Spain and all over Europe, really. So these really collaborative spaces, but obviously differentiated by gender, and the Residencia de Señoritas, like the Residencia de Estudiantes, was a residence, right? People lived there and they took classes there, and some of them were able to then take university classes at the Universidad Central de Madrid. So it's a very collaborative space, and through that space, through all of the different sorts of traditions and expectations and routines that were going on, there was also a lot of collaborating being done among the residents themselves, who later became lawyers, scholars, teachers, as well as those who taught at the Residencia, and in particular, the figure of Maria de Maeztu, who was the founder of this institute and served as director, and really tied things together intellectually between both sides of the Atlantic. And one point of connection that's particularly interesting, and one that Margarita Marquez Padorno studies in her article, is that of the Residencia de Señoritas with historically women's colleges in the Northeast United States, especially what's known as the Seven Sisters and Smith College. And we have documentation of these women going between these spaces, both as students as well as, and then in Toris Curao's article on Victoria Ocampo and Gabriela Mistral, seeing writers going between these literary spaces of Madrid and Buenos Aires, and as well as within the Residencia de Señoritas.
And then we have the Smith connection, which is delightful. As it's a delightful part of Marga's essay, especially the mention of the stockinged feet and the skirts being raised. Yes. Angela, can you capture that for us? The anecdote. Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting anecdote, and Santiago Lopez Rodriguez, I think that's his last name. I'm trying to remember. Lopez. He's a descendant of one of the women of the Residencia who went to Smith, which is really fascinating. He has some articles as well as an edited volume of one of the residents' time in the United States, which is really fascinating. Diario de Viaje. So this sense of putting the Residencia as a queer space, as a space in which women are able to have these homosocial relationships, as well as these romantic relationships that come to be at the Residencia, as well as in these historically women's spaces in the United States.
Yeah. So we're sorry that Marga couldn't be here today, but Marga's essay about the women of the Residencia, I think that it really helps serve as a transitional kind of article, right? Transitional essay between what we do in our introduction and then what the wonderful pieces that come after do, which is establish a couple of basic, I guess, kind of basic commitments, right? That the artists and the intellectuals that are being considered shared, right? They shared a commitment to community. They shared a commitment to community building and an insistence on the importance of community for creative production, right? And we see that also in Carolina Coronado, going back to the 1840s. Carolina Coronado was somebody who tried to and did foster community among women writers at a time when there were fierce debates about whether women even had the capacity to speak or whether they should be called, like kind of blue stockings, or whether they should be called poets. Do they have the right? Yeah, lots of good connections.
Yeah,
Angela's showing some images from Marga's essay.
And, like Rebecca said, Margarita was, she's done a lot of publications about the Residencia de Señoritas before, but this was her first contribution in English. And I had just popped on the screen really quickly just to remind myself as well that book. It's Santiago López Ríos Moreno has the Diario de Viaje a Estados Unidos, which is that diary of a year at Smith College. And so being able to bring this into English was really a core component of our project. I mean, logistically, Feminist Modernist Studies publishes in English. So there was, of course, a need then to translate into English, but we're also very much informed by that large corpus of work about lesbian modernity, Sapphic modernity in English. I have next to me the Interrogating Lesbian Modernism edited collection, which I really encourage those interested to check out, because it has a lot of fruitful conversations about the naming, right? Sapphic modernity, lesbian modernity, the questions of how people situate their identities, their positionality, their activism, and all sorts of things about their lives that are not so, black and white, gender binary. I think
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask real quickly, would you mind pulling up the bibliography, the reviews section from the issue?
Yes, I was thinking about that. I'll just share
One
the
of the
table
things
of
we really
contents
appreciated about this
here.
special issue was the opportunity that Feminist Modernist Studies provided us to do reviews, to commission reviews of works that were related to the topic. And so I
Yes.
just wanted us to share with people.
And one of them is a bit unique in that regard, being a project rather than a typical book, right?
Yes, but we're really grateful to Feminist Modernist Studies for doing this, because we then got to promote really great work that otherwise the largely English-speaking readership of FMS might not have encountered, right?
Yeah, they were very thoughtful in asking us what we would love to have reviewed, and work closely with their book review editor on that. Yeah, so of course we have Anna Simón-Alegre and Luciana Deutsch's collection about queer women, that really takes that approach of the literature about Las Chicas Raras, and then we have Interrogating Lesbian Modernism that I just mentioned, which is also a recent publication. And then we have something unique, which is Maite Zubiarre's work, which is based on her digital humanities project and thinking about erotic cultures in early 20th century Spain, which really ties in nicely with the projects that have been presented here. And then the last one is, for those who are familiar with feminist modernism in the Spanish context, you're probably no stranger to El Regreso de las Modernas, which is a volume by Nuria Capdevila Argüelles about why these modern women have been seen as being rescued or recovered when in fact they were such an integral part of the cultural scene and the times in which they were living. So kind of understanding that discrepancy and how it's come to be. And all of the articles and book reviews can be found on the Feminist Modernist Studies website, as well as our wonderful cover with Angeles Santos's Tertulia, which we were really excited to share, is kind of showing that shared space, collaboration. It's a really neat painting. And then we just have two other articles. Like I mentioned, not everyone was able to be here. So Margarita's article really ties in nicely with Therese Curo's article about Gabriela Mistral, Victoria Ocampo, and as well as kind of how, the Residencia de Señoritas and Maestro really served as that mediary through which they could meet, and which they are kind of having a literary dialogue, and the poems they're writing back and forth to each other, and the letters they're sharing, and things of that nature. And then finally, let me see, yes, Anne Hoag has contributed an article, not by a Spanish author, but about an Irish writer who came to Spain in these quite well-known works, Mary Lavelle and Farewell Spain. And we were really excited to have that Anglophone perspective. And it's not the typical tourist perspective exoticizing Spain. It's really fascinating way by which the author queers the idea of nationhood in kind of a similar way to how Christina was articulating it, where, women or queer individuals are not quite seen as fitting within these dynamics and gender expectations of motherhood, of being the mother of the state, and those sorts of things. So these are also two fascinating contributions that you should definitely check out. But I think, given the time, I'd love folks to be able to ask questions. Of course, Rebecca and I have some of our own to ask contributors, especially about your future research. But definitely for those who are here to share any questions you might have, feel free to put those in the chat or to raise your hand and unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to switch to gallery view for a moment so that I can see everyone. These were such great presentations today, and I really applaud Rebecca and Angela for the special issue. For those who don't know me, I run a feature for Feminist Modernist Studies called From the Feminist Classroom. And so I know the journal. And so I was just really excited that the special issue came out. I also study the Spanish Civil War. So like, I don't have much to say about Sapphic Spain myself, but well, Kate O'Brien's article got me really excited. But anyhow, my question has to do with gossip. I see it as a through line through some of at least the two first presentations. And when I think of at least the way that I think of contemporary gay culture, there is a fear of gossip. I'm thinking, for example, of the Polari, the gay British language that emerged in the mid-20th century to facilitate interaction between homosexuals in Britain, in order to kind of suss out, when the next party is, to exchange insider knowledge without necessarily gossip being able to be facilitated. And it seems like gossip to some degree worked in terms of performativity, and really enabled the two figures that Jeff presented to us, enabled them to kind of work in some sort of like symbiotic happening that was of the moment, and certainly performative, but also was incredibly detrimental. I think of how gossip now is, the gay culture might have embraced gossip to a certain degree. I think of the show The L Word and its infamous map that one of the characters traces like all of the gay relationships on. And I'm curious about how, we know from as modernists that gossip could lead to criminal prosecution. And that certainly came through in Elena's presentation. Gossip was being published in newspapers and people's reputations were being defended. I'm curious, though, if there's more to say about the line, for example, the tenuous line between Sapphism and lesbianism, and if one is called one or the other in terms of gossip, and just if there's more there. I think I've spoken enough. I really enjoyed the presentations. I will see if there's another question that comes to mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I would defer to Jeffrey, Jeff Zamostny on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond briefly. I mean, I think everything you said is really spot on. My own feeling is that most of the figures that I study, Retana, Tortola, Zamora, reveled in gossip. I think they enjoyed it. I do think that it could be dangerous and risque. Retana landed himself in prison multiple times. Oyosibinend died in prison during the Spanish Civil War. Tortola repudiated some forms of gossip against her and ended up being quite secluded in the last 25 years of her life. But during the period that I was looking at in particular, the 1910s, I think there was much more an embracing of gossip as a form of building up their celebrity and public personas, which they seem to be quite comfortable and content to do, at least during that brief time period, when, of course, terrible things were happening in the rest of Europe. But in Spain, with neutrality and the influx of foreign entertainers, a lot of things were happening culturally that had not happened previously in Spain, that led to, great modernization and risk-taking, I think. Thank you.
Maybe we could also talk a little bit about like the idea of like invertida, right? Like this idea of how I don't know how familiar folks are with that, but just kind of thinking about how homosexuality was situated at the time, especially for women. I guess I could just briefly say, you know, the idea of like this inversión del instinto, right? This inversion of instinct that we see in a lot of mentioned in works like Hidden Path or El Oculto Sendero. We see kind of ways in which this pathologizing of homosexuality has kind of come to the forefront of the cultural imaginary about lesbianism, and also at a time in which a lot of works were created for the reading pleasure of men, featuring these lesbian relationships through things like kiosk literature, which folks might be already very familiar with, right? So, and it's a very interesting moment to study, and also thinking about then, of course, what comes next with the Civil War and the Franco dictatorship.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I'm glad you referenced Elena Fortun again, Angela, because Elena Fortun, very much forms part of kind of what I almost view as a continuum of queer culture involving people like Retana, Zamora, Tortula, Vicente on the one hand, and then Fortun and the circle of people that she was moving in, who very much did seem to be concerned with gossip. They did not want to be known publicly in relation to questions of lesbianism or sapphism at all. And so, I do see, and yet they had some interesting connections to these much more extravagant and out-type figures. So there's those two kind of poles that queer culture is moving between at the time.
I just want to note that I just put in the chat a link to one of Jeffrey Zamostny's books, co-edited with Susan Larson, who's at Texas Tech, on kiosk literature of Silver Age Spain. And so this could be of great interest for modernists here.
Thank you. Yeah, and I see we have another question in the chat, and I think it's directed for Jeffrey Samotny, but I think other folks can definitely chime in about the question of the labor of acquiring these archival materials, right? Just having one image taken, not let alone several dozen, is very challenging, and the question of, some of them are being in black and white, some of them in color. So maybe if you don't mind starting off, Jeff, talking about the question of archives and interpreting these drawings, these images, and then other folks kind of sharing their kind of point of entry into these archives of work. Because I think, like I mentioned earlier, for as much as it's debated whether, use of terminology, the real question comes down to what can be derived from the archives, what needs to be then inferred, what's coming from gossip and other sorts of materials that are outside of the archives or within living memory and all sorts of things. So it'd be interesting for our contributors to share a little bit about archives.
Yeah, just very briefly, to directly answer the question about who is the artist of most of the images, it was Jose Zamora, both the paintings and the drawings that were being displayed. But yeah, I mean, my work is certainly very labor intensive, and is the result of working on this for 17 years and accumulating a lot of archival materials very slowly. One of the questions that Angela posed was, how did you come to this topic? And really, for me, it was being introduced by Susan Larson, my dissertation director, to one kind of figure in my story, Alvaro Retana, and from there accumulating so much information about him and figures that are sort of peripheral in that story. As I accumulate more and more, I can start to construct their stories and make them the center of the story. And that's certainly what I did for Tortula, and then from my work on her, on Zamora. But certainly the fact that, since the time I completed my dissertation, the Hemeroteca Digital de la Biblioteca Nacional has amassed so much that's available digitally and that can be searched, not unproblematically, but it certainly facilitates that sort of archival work. And one spends a lot of time looking at material that maybe is not immediately relevant, but one never knows when it might become relevant as you start reframing. So that's kind of my constant struggle, how can I reframe so that things that I found can indeed become key points in the story?
Definitely. And it's interesting, and you mentioned briefly in your article about how Tortola has been drawn in this graphic novel about La Sin Sombrero and how it portrays her relationship with her partner, which is very interesting. Would anyone else like to chime in about archives?
So in my case, I did the same as Jeff. I have been gathering a lot of material. And one of the reasons why me and Kyle collaborate on this article, it's because during my dissertation, I found one article about the death of Vicente. And from that article, I wasn't sure if she died at that time. But then with time and La Biblioteca Nacional putting all the newspapers in, I was able to locate a second article that actually mentioned Tete. And yeah, it was a lot of work locating every single newspaper, magazine, a postcard that I could find about Angeles Vicente. It was, yeah. And yeah, it's a lot of work. And I wish that I could have found anything that it was published in Argentina, but I did not have the time or the means to travel over to Buenos Aires. Yeah.
Yes, your article in particular, you both really carefully documented those newspaper articles. I hope folks will kind of follow the thread of that. We have just a few minutes left. I don't know if anyone else wanted to respond to the question of archives or if there's any other quick questions we can wrap up with. Maybe if you could share briefly about future work. Any, forthcoming publications or things you're working on now that you might want to share. I know Rebecca has her translation project she's been working on. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I'm very excited about this project. I'm very grateful to Ann Cruz, who is an editor of a series at Louisiana State. And I've been in discussions with the press to publish this volume of translations, which is great because we're going to get 40 translations by Coronado out into a decent English. And I'm so hopeful that this will help more kind of comparative studies and other, transnational, transatlantic, right, global connections among modernists, and and to help situate Coronado into those kinds of discussions.
Absolutely. And then to have all of the extra critical apparatus you're putting together.
I'll just briefly say I mentioned kind of my methodology of going from sort of one peripheral figure to the next and kind of making them the center of my work. And the one I'm working on now is a painter and illustrator named Antonio Juez Nieto, who I discovered was actually called the Jose Zamora of Badajoz. So this is an illustrator who was in that sort of Madrid circle with Retana and Zamora and Tortola in the 1910s and was pretty well integrated in it, but seemed to kind of renounce his ties to that group and go back to Badajoz, where he was very bizarre. On the one hand, he was extremely flamboyant dandy, and he did all of these extremely decadent paintings. But on the other hand, he was also doing a lot of commissions for the Catholic Church and very conservative cultural figures. He was very pro-Franco during the Spanish Civil War. And so that bizarre sort of mix is intriguing to me right now. Very much in the early stages, though.
Very interesting. I'm so
I have
excited
a
to
question
see.
for Jeff. Just building on that, Jeff, are you encountering a lot of visual materials that are helping you build analysis?
Yes, yes. And I'm going to Badajoz this summer, so I hope to find more. Yeah, some of his work is in Portugal as well. He was also a pretty important figure for kind of promoting relations between Spain and Portugal. So very multifaceted figure.
Anything else anyone wants to quickly shout out for future projects? I'm excited to continue working on the question of tributes to writers and how that's kind of shaped the literary canon as something that is working into a manuscript, as well as future projects about science fiction from the period, which is also a really fascinating area of study. If there's no other questions, we're at time, and we're so grateful to have had the Ohio State Colloquium, colleagues at South Carolina, Feministas Unidas members. Thank you all so much for being here, for listening, and we hope that you'll take a look at some of the articles in this special issue.
Wait, we see we've got one more hand raised by Laura.
So I was applauding, but I can also just say that, like, when I did my master's in Spanish, the only kind of lesbian or sapphic representation was el mismo mar de todos los veranos. And so it's so wonderful that the special issue is now published and out there. And I mean, especially in English, so that there is this like cross-fertilization. And it makes me very excited that a younger generation coming up now of scholars will be exposed to much more like a wider variety of LGBTQ Spanish lit and visual culture and cultural production more generally than I was when I was in my master's degree. This is phenomenal. Congratulations, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you again to Ana and to Feministas Unidas for hosting this discussion and hosting this space so that these ideas could be presented to a wider audience. Thank you.
So thank you so much to everyone, and I want to mention that with the comment of Laura, when Lou and I, we published the book, we have some comments about, oh, you are both so brave, to publish something like this about the Spanish literature. We can see something is different, and Lou and I, we were like, come on, what's going on, and later we realized how important is, like Laura mentioned, to open the canon, but not only the canon, to new voices, new ways to approach authors, because, it's super important. So thank you so much, everyone, to share this wonderful afternoon, Friday afternoon, talking about queer, sapphic, and women and men. They were very brave to be different, even like with just kind of claros oscuros that Jeffrey mentioned about his new project. So, and yeah, looking forward to our next event is Wednesday. We are going to present another book about the African identity in Iberian. So everyone is welcoming. So thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend. Okay, bye bye.